What we're going to do is we're going to take some questions and answers at the end of the meeting. So if you've got anything, if you can just wait until that point. Following on from the talk as well, we want to welcome you to have a look around some of the apartments that we've got here. So myself and Chloe, who also works for the sales team, will be happy to show you around. So I'm shortly going to introduce two of the guests, but I'd like a moment to explain in more detail what City & Country does as a business and the work that we carry out to date here at Donaldson's. As some of you already know, City & Country is a family-owned business which has a long and successful legacy of restoring and converting historic, often listed buildings around the UK. With almost 60 years' experience, we are proud of our reputation as the UK's leading heritage developer. A desire to preserve as much of our built heritage as possible sits at the heart of what we do, and with all our projects, we painstakingly restore original features, bringing them back to life so that it can be enjoyed for generations to come. When we first purchased Donaldson's back in 2014, we knew we had a big task on our hands, as this building could become a truly fantastic place for people to live. Of course, the Playfair striking design is the masterwork of world-famous architect William Henry Playfair, whose other famous works include the National Monument and the National Gallery of Scotland. There's a great affection for the Playfair due to its design and location. Many people have walked or driven past the front of the building, admiring its striking appearance, and this is very much down to the design. Restoring the building properly has therefore not just been important for Edinburgh, but also important for Scotland. You can see for yourselves that the building possesses many wonderful original features, as the lofty high ceilings, huge windows, domed turrets, internal spiral staircases, and the central clock tower, to name a few. Our team of architects and historians began investigating into the history of the building to better understand how it was originally constructed. This essential information helped with the design details and the restoration methods that we use today. Importantly, we wanted to use as much of the building as possible. So we redesigned previous plans to ensure that every part of the building was brought back to beneficial use, including the basements and turrets. The basements have been converted into stylish studios and one-bedroom apartments, while the turrets have been cleverly designed to provide a range of unique and functional spaces, including studies, dressing rooms and bathrooms. The lofts have been converted to create magnificent penthouses and apartments with private terraces. The flagstone floors throughout the ground floors have required extensive work following the removal of modern floor finishes above. Stonemasons have also restored the historic stonework around the building, including the stone balustrade on the upper terrace. Possibly most striking is the conversion of the formal chapel, a truly remarkable space featuring dramatic stained glass windows, which is now home to 3 apartments and a communal area which we are currently sitting in. I'd encourage everybody after the discussion to have a little look at this apartment in the chapel. Now, back to today. Firstly, I'm delighted to say we are joined by George Clarke, whose personal passion for heritage and building conservation needs little introduction. As a business, we've worked with George for many years now, and we will share the same desire to protect and reuse historic buildings, whatever challenges they may throw at us. For more than a decade, George has been at the forefront of discussion around architectural heritage and how we preserve it, often gracing our screens and showing us many wonderful examples of such work around the world. And secondly, I'm equally delighted to say that we are joined by Nicholas Hoffman from Edinburgh World Heritage. George and Nick are here to discuss Edinburgh's unique architectural heritage, which of course includes the Playfair building, some of the challenges and opportunities when it comes to preserving buildings of this nature for future generations. So please give them both a warm Edinburgh welcome, and we hope you enjoy the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. What a turnout. So good. This is amazing. It must be the free champagne. It's not about us whatsoever, is it, Nick? Yeah, as has been mentioned, I've been an ambassador for City and Country for many years now. I think it's about 8 or 9 years. And I get involved in the restoration and conversion of lots of their buildings. It's been really nice actually coming to Donaldson's, because I came when the building was first obtained by City and Country and walked around virtually every part of the building before any work had started whatsoever. Just to show City and Country's passion for the original architecture. I mean, they employ a whole team of historians. There's not many developers out there who have a team of historians who do lots of background research, not just to get planning, it's because they genuinely care about the building. And I could tell, even before I signed for City and Country many years ago, that the passion for history and architectural detailing and doing the right thing for the building is at the core of their business. Yes, they're developers, and developers got an awful connotation sometimes, hasn't it? But I would never have teamed up with City and Country if they weren't doing buildings that they were really passionate about and doing it really well. So it's an honour to be here today for me. To be honest, I've been back, 3 or 4 times, I think, over the last few years when the work's been done on the building, and it's been an absolute joy to see a piece of history like this, a wonderful piece of architecture, converted into some great apartments. And what a mix of apartments we've got. It's been mentioned by Mark, at the end of all this, we're going to do a little Q&A. So if you have got any questions, feel free to chip in. We want it to be very relaxed today. It's not a formal lecture. It's actually me and Nick having a chat about Edinburgh World Heritage, about this building, about Edinburgh generally, to be honest with you, because what a beautiful city it is and how the architecture is so good. A little bit of a Q&A if you want to. If you're too shy, it's fine. You can just drink some more champagne. And then Mark and members of his team would be happy to show you around. I do think you should have a look at the apartment at the back, the chapel apartment. I mean, they're all beautiful, but the one at the back's amazing. I've just been filming in there this morning. To have a 3-storey apartment, even that sounds weird saying that, a 3-storey apartment, it's like having a townhouse inside a piece of history. It's not really an apartment building. It's quite an amazing conversion, actually. It shows you how difficult it is to do these buildings as well. So the building's got lots of opportunities in terms of its rich history and its texture and detailing, but my God, they're hard to convert and do a brilliant job. But I think the guys have done a fantastic job on this building. We're just going to jump in. So me and Nick are just going to have a bit of a chat. I'm going to bombard him with lots of questions. It's normally me that gets bombarded with questions, to be honest, but it's Nick's turn today. We'll talk for about half an hour, probably maximum, really. We don't want you getting too tired, particularly this little one off on the sofa. And then, feel free to chip in. So through the talk, if there's any questions that you're desperate to ask at the end, please go for it. Nick, I suppose we should open up on Edinburgh World Heritage in this brilliant city. Before we get into Donaldson's and Henry Playfair, tell me what Edinburgh World Heritage does day to day.
We're a World Heritage site, so we're one of 6 in Scotland, the old and new towns of Edinburgh. And that was inscribed by UNESCO in 1995. But the history of conservation in the city goes back much longer than that. Actually, you could say back to Walter Scott, when it was realized that when everyone moved to the new town, the old town was in a parlous state. So really the conservation movement goes back to the early 19th century. However, the most recent history is in the 60s, believe it or not, we were at risk of losing the new town. So can you imagine a site that's 2,700 listed buildings? Many of the streets on the outer areas were really ready for demolition, and Jamaica Street was demolished by the council. There were plans for Princess Street to become a dual carriageway, and residents were concerned. So throughout the new town, residents' associations started to take action, get organised. So it was a grassroots thing. At the same time, there was the Scottish Civic Trust was founded in 1967. Sir Robert Matthew was a great architect. And he declared in 1967 at the foundation of the Scottish Civic Trust that something must be done about Edinburgh's new town. And in 1970, there was an international conference at the Assembly Rooms. John Betjeman, people from France who had conserved the Marais area of Paris, about a third of the size of the new town. People from the Scottish office, from the council. And it was agreed then that action needed to be taken. And so a group was established called the Edinburgh Newtown Conservation Committee. And if you go around the new town, you will see little plaques on many of the streets which have an acanthus, a palmette rather, a little palmette, and it will have the date. And those were streets that were conserved by the Newtown group, starting in Heriot Row, Fettes Row, around there. And since then, there have been 1,500 projects. So we have saved the new town. and it's our 50th anniversary. There is a gala dinner on November the 13th. So there are a few tickets
That's
left.
a very good plug. I love that. You're straight
Well,
in
that
there.
was a big lead up.
Excellent, very good.
We have a dinner on the November the 13th back at the Assembly Rooms to celebrate 50 years of conservation in Edinburgh. We like to say that it is the most successful example of urban regeneration and conservation in Europe. Not the cities that were bombed to smithereens, but in terms of the conservation of existing buildings, it's the best example, really, in Europe.
I can already
background.
tell that we're going to go off script already. I might as well just throw this in the bin, to be honest with you, in the nicest way. The change in perception of historic buildings was quite amazing when you think, I mean, I'm an architect, so I shouldn't knock architects too much, but what architects did in the 1960s, and sometimes their approach to historic buildings, let's say it was unusual.
Yeah. There was a turning point in Edinburgh in George Square. So George Square was it's an 18th century, it's a Georgian square. It's a prototype of the new town. George and Walter Scott grew up there, number 8, I think. A number of luminaries lived there, and it was an example of better town planning, Georgian architecture before the new town. In the 1960s, Robert Matthew again was commissioned by the university to demolish and then to build university buildings. And they succeeded. About half of the buildings were constructed. What was David Hume Tower and all the buildings on the south, the library. The library is now listed. Historic Scotland have listed it. But half the buildings remained. Anyway, in the 1960s, people in Edinburgh suddenly realized what they were going to potentially lose in George Square. The actual Catholic chaplaincy was instrumental in basically organizing really a sort of grassroots protest against the demolition. And the Catholic chaplaincy is still there on the east side. So about half of George Square was saved. From that point onwards, they realized we have something which is of world value, world significance in terms of Edinburgh's Georgian architecture and its heritage. And so that was really the turning point, George.
And it seems obvious for us to think that these buildings should be saved now, but I mean, characters like John Betjeman, I mean, he saved St Pancras Station in London, didn't he? There's a statue of John Betjeman there that he saved that building.
That's right, and the Georgian Society was founded, he was obviously a Victorian man, but also the Georgian Society was founded about the same time for Bath and Edinburgh.
And we find it shocking today that people would consider demolishing these buildings, but we lost a lot. And Edinburgh lost a bit as well, didn't it?
Edinburgh didn't lose too much. Obviously, Edinburgh was not bombed. And Edinburgh, because of the conservative nature of the sort of residents, did not suffer the fate of Glasgow in terms of the encroachment of roads and the car is king culture. Never reached Edinburgh, which means to this day it takes longer to get to the airport, really, than it does to drive from the airport to Glasgow. By the time you've got through Castorphin and all the smaller roads, you could have got to Glasgow. But that's because, obviously in Glasgow, the city centre was really ruined into the fact that the cathedral is blocked off from the rest of the city by the motorway. So Edinburgh did not suffer that fate, partly because it's an innately conservative city. Lord Cockburn and the Cockburn Association was really the first campaigning group to save historic buildings back in the 19th century. So it always had a culture of Walter Scott, again, a key figure in making sure people understood the value of the heritage, the value of the traditions in the city.
What makes Edinburgh's World Heritage unique? There's a big question.
I want to show you some visuals of it because talking about architect. I couldn't try and mime it for you, but it's best the essence of. Let me just move forward a little bit here because the essence of Edinburgh, in terms of a World Heritage site, is that it's a city of contrasts. So this is actually an inscription. Each World Heritage site has an inscription which says formally, legally, officially what values the World Heritage site possesses, which make it of outstanding universal value. And at the core of Edinburgh's inscription is the concept of a city of contrasts between, and this is a map from the late 18th century, between the extraordinary example of a medieval city with the organic old town, with its wide, what was not really the Royal Mile at the time, but we call it now the Royal Mile, but a series of markets, a series of market squares running down from the castle to the palace. It's the best example of a medieval city plan, certainly in the UK, if not in Europe. So it has a wide market running down the middle, and then it has these what were called burgage plots running off, grand houses facing the street, and then Behind them, gardens, which were used to grow vegetables, but then were filled in. And those are our closes. And today we still have over 100 closes in the Old Town. Some of them beautifully conserved, others in a bit of a mess. So that's a job for the future. So that's the Old Town. Contrasting then, obviously, with the planned Georgian New Town. At the time of this map, 1778, you can see that it's only got so far down George Street. It's about a third of the way down. St Andrew's Square has been finished, and they're a little bit down. So that's at the core of our inscription is of international significance, these two cities side by side. In other historic cities, they're built on top of each other. If you go to Istanbul, the layers of history go down and down and down and down and down. In Edinburgh, because of the structure of the Old Town being on its rock, the two cities are next to each other with the wonderful Princess Street Gardens between them, what Walter Scott called the Great Arena. So as you emerge from the old entrance to Waverley Station, which is now closed, but traditionally you would emerge from Waverley Station, you would see the Great Arena of Princess Street Gardens, which used to be the Norloch, and then with the Old Town to your left and the New Town to your right. So that's the essence of it. But the topography of the city, we're blessed by being a city with very interesting topography, so you can see the city. It's not a flat city. You can see where you are. You can see the vistas down to the Firth of Forth and to Arthur's Seat and so on. So I could talk about for hours about this.
Well, so we've gone completely off script, which is brilliant. Now, before you got to that plan, you jumped to a few images of some buildings.
Yes, so
do you want to just go back and
Donaldson's.
talk us through some of them? Because, I mean, obviously we'll get the Donaldsons
Donaldson's
in more
is
detail.
important. I mean, Donaldson, obviously it's one of many, many world-class buildings in Edinburgh. And it comes at a period of time where the city was shifting from being focused on the neoclassical to exploring different themes within the Gothic revival. And there are many Gothic revival buildings in Edinburgh, and Donaldson's is one. It's loosely termed Jacobean. So this little corner of Gothic revival, it's called Jacobean. Gifford, the famous architectural historian, sort of coined that term for this building.
So half Jacobean, half
Jacobean,
Elizabethan.
half Elizabethan, although the original trustees said they wanted an Elizabethan building. So why did the trustees of Donaldson's want an Elizabethan building? It was partly a rejection of the neoclassical, because the 18th century was thought to be a little bit sordid. The Georgians were a little bit, they were atheists, they had sex clubs. Who's heard about the Beggar's Benison?
No, come on, I'm intrigued.
I'm not going to go into it.
I mean, you've got my attention
Someone must
now.
know. No, it was a time,
Nick.
I mean, the Scottish Enlightenment was a time of great intellectual freedom and sexual freedom. There were lots of different things happening in Edinburgh. It was very exciting.
And the Battle of the Styles.
The Battle of the
it was
Styles.
national, wasn't it? Between
was,
the
it
Gothic
was.
revival and neoclassical.
Gothic revival started in the middle of the 18th century, but didn't get to Edinburgh at that point. Edinburgh was still at the high point of its obsession with the neoclassical, and Playfair came towards the end of that. And his particular part of neoclassical architecture is called Greek revival. So he's a Greek man, along with Alexander Greek Thompson in Glasgow. But the trustees wanted an Elizabethan building. So if you think about that, it's the scholastic tradition, the educational tradition in England is that they were really harking back to. So these are two examples. We have Eton College on the left and St John's College, Cambridge on the right. So these are examples of academic buildings.
And it was
that
was seen as being the kind of, I've got to be careful saying English when I'm in Scotland, but it was seen as being the true English style, wasn't it?
So
it was the medieval architecture, and if you like, the neoclassical style buildings were Italianate, it was Renaissance, it was seen as being Catholic elsewhere.
Oxford and Cambridge tradition. So, and Playfair said that his aim was to create a building worthy of comparison of the remains of Old English architecture. I avoided carefully all mixture of Roman mouldings with the Gothic. So he was very much responding to the brief he had from the trustees of Donaldson's to create something which echoed those great centres of educational excellence.
He was very brave doing English style in Scotland, I have to say.
Not at all, but obviously there was an example in Edinburgh as well. I mean, this is obviously George Heriot's, which is an absolute splendid Renaissance palace in the heart of Edinburgh, and it's a 17th century building, so real Scottish Renaissance. But obviously it mixes lots of little sort of neoclassical elements there. It's obviously before the main neoclassical period, but it starts to introduce neoclassical elements.
It's kind of neoclassical and a bit of baronial.
It is. It's like the Tron Kirk on the High Street. It combines, it has pilasters and pediments and so on, but it's still recognisably Scottish. But that was rejected in favour of something which really was much more English. Obviously, Playfair at the same time was working for his commission for the Free Kirk, and that was New College. So this is the entrance to New College, again, which is very similar to St John's College, Cambridge. And this is the English comparison, obviously very familiar to lovers of Downton Abbey. This is Highclere Castle from the 1840s as well. So this was, again, examples of this Jacobean trend that Playfair was basically responding to.
But he is famous for doing other buildings in different styles.
Absolutely, yeah. So, if you mention
Couldn't be
Playfair,
more different.
As I said, he's most associated with the Greek Revival. So if we think about neoclassical architecture in Edinburgh, we start our journey really at the Royal Exchange, which is now City Chambers. So that was John Adam, not Robert, and that was from the 1760s. So there you see, it's more of a Palladian style. It looks like a Venetian country manor. I don't have a picture of that particular building. Anyway, so it starts there, and then we move through the various neoclassical periods with Adam, and we get to the Greek Revival. So these are the buildings most associated with Playfair. This is the Royal Academy, which
It's
is
quite
from the
amazing.
1820s.
It's amazing the difference in style, isn't it? And then a client says, do you know what, I don't want that style. I want a
Yes.
bit of Jacobean. Can you just give me that instead?
Yeah.
And he goes, yeah, fine.
So what's interesting about this building is that it's very, very strict and austere and true to the Greek Doric spirit. So he copies all of the devices and elements and details from that very early period of Greek architecture, the period of Greek architecture, classical architecture, that was thought to be most pure, closest to the traditional temples that were built in forests and clearings. And you can even see remnants on the stone of things which echo the wooden temple, the original Greek wooden temple, what looked like the end of beams and so on. They're copied in the stone, just to echo back to that purest, earliest phase of Greek architecture. So that was the 1820s. And then Playfair obviously is associated with what I suppose you would call the fourth new town. So that's the Calton development. All of the fantastic streets around Calton Hill were really master planned by Playfair, and they were meant to actually go down almost towards Leith. But anyway, what we have in Regent Terrace, Carlton Terrace, and so on, these streets were where he really made his name. I mean, Playfair was interesting because he started very much in the tradition of Adam. He was commissioned to finish Old College. So Adam had been commissioned, Robert Adam, to start Old College. He died, and so it was finished then by Playfair. He won a competition then to finish Old College.
So before we jump into more detail on Donaldson's, what is the kind of, I suppose, the role and the challenge of what you do now? I mean, you've talked about the 60s and the 70s and how things were formed and how buildings were protected. What's the main challenge of your organisation now?
Conservation remains sort of at the heart of what we do. So the conservation of buildings, for some reason, people in Edinburgh, Scots, people in general, do not maintain their buildings. So the rule of thumb is that you should really think about 1% of the value of the property a year being set aside for its maintenance. In Glasgow, there's a factoring system, which is excellent for anyone that has property in Glasgow. And it means you don't have to think about that. You have an expert who really will make sure that you're setting aside enough money as a group of tenants in a tenement. But 1%, so in a new town house these days, that's about £15,000, £2,000, £20,000 a year. You need to be thinking about conserving your building. So that sort of neglect is still an issue. The other issues we work on are Airbnb. So in terms of the threats to Edinburgh, Edinburgh has the highest concentration of Airbnbs of anywhere in Europe.
Does it?
So I think I have a map here.
I didn't know that.
It's
highest
it's
concentration.
an absolute curse. No offence. To anyone who's made a lot of money out of Airbnb. I've got a visual here. I've lost it. Anyway, there are about 10,000 in the city. So we see that as a direct threat to our communities. So just in my street, Albany Street, which is a fairly affluent street in the new town, there are 20 Airbnbs in the street.
And what's the problem with Airbnbs, as you
So
said?
Airbnbs, they really mean that there's a tourism monoculture. The rental prices for young people who may not be able to afford to buy somewhere skyrocket. Property prices in general go up. Edinburgh's had a most ridiculous boom in property prices over the last couple of years. There's antisocial behaviour issues. Again, Edinburgh is a city of tenements. That's our traditional way of living. and on a sort of 4-story 18th or 19th century tenement, if half of the small flats are Airbnbs, there's noise, there's people banging up and down the stairs. They're really loathed in the city. Anyway, the city, after much lobbying, is about to introduce really strict regulation for that. The other challenges are new development. This is obviously the St James Centre. This is the original St James Centre up on the left, a sort of secondary area to the east of the new town. The Basil Spence buildings from the 1960s, and then what we have here is obviously the new hotel. We don't object to the actual shopping centre itself, but the hotel we did object to as not being sympathetic or not responding to the Edinburgh context, the patina, the texture, the feel of Edinburgh. So new development is something that we need to continually keep an eye on. Donaldson's obviously is an exception to that.
And how do you balance that old and new? Well, maybe we talk about historically the battle of the styles, and we have it today, don't we?
The best new architecture, and I'm thinking of Malcolm Fraser, for example, is a good architect with the Storytelling Centre, and also with the Poetry Library. So there are many examples of, if you like, postmodern architecture. Advocates Close is another one, if you walk up and down Advocates Close. These are modern buildings. They're not in any way pastiche, unlike the Crown Hotel on the High Street. They're not pastiche, but they respond to the spirit of the city in terms of their scale, materials, their use, etc. So that's something that we're getting better at now, but this was approved really just after the financial crash 2008, so the city was on the back foot, thinking, yes, any money is good money. So that's an area we work on. So we have our list of values that UNESCO has said Edinburgh stands for, and anything which damages that is against the law in Scotland. And that's the sort of, if you like, the authority we have. Development which damages OUV, outstanding universal value of the site, shall not be allowed. So that's what we can say. At the end of the day, though, politicians make the decision. So the people you elect to represent you sit on the planning committee, and this was approved by a split vote. Various people weren't there at the time, so it went through. So there we are.
I'm not going to talk about politicians today. I'll get in all sorts of trouble.
Well, the other thing is sort of what we would call the banalisation of Scottish culture. So another thing we're campaigning on is tartan tattery. So we have a phenomenal...
Tartan tattery.
Tartan tattery. It's an academic term.
That's a brilliant academic term. I love that.
So obviously anyone will know that the Royal Mile has become a tourism monoculture.
Yeah.
And it's actually vastly important to the cashmere industry. A lot of stuff, schmuck, is sold there. Most of it, though, is not made in Scotland. So there are issues. There's complex issues with the retail sector in the Old Town, and the fact that the Old Town is no longer really for residents. And if there's one thing that drives people in Edinburgh mad, is when whole parts of the city are sort of cordoned off for visitors and tourists. That drives us round the bend. So everywhere should be a mixture of communities, of students, of the old, of the young. That's really, the Scottish Enlightenment grew out of this tightly packed city where everyone was cheek by jowl together. No zones for tourists, no zones for students, etc. We like living together on our traditional tenement in buildings like this, where we meet people in the corridor. That's the Scottish way of living. So anything which goes against that drives us round the bend.
That's a very good seamless link to this building. I know you've talked about Playfair and the outside of the building and the battle of the styles, but let's talk about the kind of conversion and refurbishment and restoration of Playfair. What role did the heritage groups play in this building and the balance of old and new, which we should talk about?
I mean, in terms of the regulatory regime in Edinburgh, obviously the plans will have been scrutinised in detail by the city planning group, and they have experts in the World Heritage Site and so on. Historic Scotland would have been involved, evaluating all the plans, and EWH ourselves, we would have provided also formal advice as to whether the OUV was threatened or not. But apart from that, that's pretty much it. It's relatively light touch. So we would not have scrutinised it in more detail than that.
And let's be honest, this is a building that maybe in the 60s and early 70s could have been lost quite easily.
Yes, I mean, there is an embarrassment of riches, and there are a number of former school buildings. So in Edinburgh, the challenges are to find sustainable long-term uses for former churches and former schools. And the National Gallery is a good example. The modern National Gallery, there was two schools. So there you have two fine examples of 19th century neoclassical architecture, and those form the two wings of the National Gallery of Modern Art. So that's a good example of finding a use. Donaldson's is another example of finding a good sustainable use for a former school. But then we have hundreds of churches, because the Scots in the 19th century fell out quite regularly. Literally, there are hundreds of churches were established in the period from 1800 to 1880, 1890. Some of those, Lyne and Turnbull, the auction house, is a fantastic example of a secession church in Broughton Street. That's now their very grand auction house. But there are many other buildings that don't have that sustainable use. So that's an important challenge, is finding a sustainable use, because it's no good conserving a building, looking after the external fabric and the roof and so on, if it doesn't have a long-term sustainable use. That is the challenge for conservationists, to be honest.
And is it true that Queen Victoria wanted this building? She wanted to swap it for Holyrood House?
I think she certainly was very impressed with her visit. I mean, partly because of its charitable use and the visionary way that it was really managed in the early years. She definitely fell in love. I hear what I read the last couple of days. She fell in love with the building. Yeah,
Brilliant.
It's an important building. It's not the most important building in the World Heritage Site. It's an example of one of many important school buildings, and there are at least 10. So it's a significant building. It's a fantastic opportunity to live here, but it's not the most significant. Heriot's is probably the most important school building in the city. Much earlier, much more Scottish, less of a copy.
And its position in the city is quite amazing, isn't it? I mean, you can be
Yeah,
in town
the West End is an interesting part of the city. Haymarket is being developed, so it's an area. The West End of Edinburgh will have a slightly London feel, I think, because it will be a good combination of old and new in this area. Obviously, buildings going up at Haymarket, just outside the World Heritage Site as well.
So no Airbnbs in here, is that what we're saying?
Well, at the moment, you with the new regime, you will need planning approval. So there's no reason why Airbnbs shouldn't occur here, but it would need to be approved by the city. So that's something to watch out. If you have a residents' association as well, that would be something that they should think about. But there's no legal reason not to have an Airbnb, but it would need to receive planning permission, just like a hotel would, or a normal bed and breakfast. That's the new regime. So the whole of Edinburgh will be deemed an area where that degree of regulation is required. So it should help address the issue for the future.
And I suppose what's important is that this building's been saved and it's got a new purpose.
Yes, I think this building was always going to be saved. I mean, it was never on the at-risk list. Historic Scotland keep a list of buildings which are on the at-risk register. At the moment, Tron Kirk is on the at-risk register in the High Street. The Royal High School, which we haven't talked about, but which is also, having said that Heriot's was the most important school in the city, Royal High School was probably the second, Thomas Hamilton's new Greek Revival building. So that has also been saved recently. There were plans for it to become a luxury hotel, which I'm sure you read about, George. And that decision finally went all the way up to the Scottish ministers, and it's now going to be a music school. So that's, again, a good sustainable use for the old Royal High School.
And I don't want to put you on the spot, but how many buildings are on the at-risk register
Not
in
many.
Scotland?
In Scotland, probably under 20.
Right, okay.
Not many. So that's a reflection of the work that's been done over 50 years. So it's and in Edinburgh it's just one.
And that's pretty good, because with historic England it's in the thousands.
Yes.
Which is really bad.
Yeah. No, it's
Really
a
bad.
good
I'm
achievement.
glad Scotland's
Yeah.
winning that battle,
Yeah.
which is good. Should we open it up to questions, or is there anything else you want to touch on, Nick? Because we went completely off script.
Yeah. What else
Absolutely off script completely, but we've talked about
Actually,
everything from Edinburgh.
a friend of mine is Sandy Stoddard. So another detail on the Playfair story is this, although it looks like a neoclassical sculpture, this is a very recent piece of art by Alexander Stoddard, who's a Paisley sculptor, who's the Queen's sculptor in Ordinary. And he's responsible for David Hume in the High Street, Adam Smith, and the most recent one is Playfair. So it's a very interesting, if you're interested in Playfair, it's worth going and enjoying the sculpture. Also, around the base, there are descriptions or depictions of Edina and Athena in Sandy's imagination, and also the Greek god Hypnos, who is the god of sleep. And Sandy Stoddard believes that Playfair created buildings which were particularly restful, as opposed to much other architecture, particularly enjoyable and restful and put people at ease. So he thought it very appropriate that the Greek god Hypnos would be, if you like, the patron saint, not really, sort of. The Greek god most associated with Playfair. But that's outside the National Museum. It's an absolutely stunning piece of work, obviously neoclassical in style. So that's interesting. The other thing about Playfair is his role in the creation of the greatest PR campaign of all time, which is the Athens of the North.
Yeah.
The self-branding.
Brilliant.
That Edinburgh is Athens to London's Rome. That London is the seat of military and colonial power, and that Edinburgh is the conscience, the intellectual integrity behind empire. We won't talk about slavery, and we won't talk about colonialism generally, which are deeply ingrained in Edinburgh, just in other cities. However, that's an important part of the whole Greek revival piece. Led people to make this visual comparison. And also, these are two pictures. One, probably seen this. One is of Athens, and the other is Edinburgh. There's a remarkable visual similarity. There's not a climatic similarity, but in terms of the distance to the port, and to the Acropolis, and Arthur's Seat, and Calton Hill, and so on, there are lots of visual similarities. So Playfair's interesting because he was part of that campaign to bring back the initiative and the energy to the capital city after the Act of Union, so that Edinburgh had its own distinctive and important role within empire and within British culture.
Genius bit of PR.
Genius. Yeah,
Very
love
good.
it.
Very
Love
good. Any questions? Are you all going to go quiet? I love this bit. Go on here. Yeah, go ahead.
I would like you to ask something about, not Donaldson's, but about Princes Street. And it seems to me that things have got better since the 1960s over knocking down stuff in a sort of municipal dereliction duty to a sort of municipal submission to do with the value of money, so that we now, instead of having the possibility of Princes Street dying, buildings coming down, we have the possibility of it dying because of municipal neglect. And the fact that the decision about the St James's Quarter has effectively taken the trade and everything else. So you tell me what the World Heritage Site wants to do and wants everybody else in the city to help do to save Princes Street from becoming a street of hotels and nothing else.
Princes Street never really sort of fulfilled its potential. Right from the beginning, it was thought of as a residential street, but very quickly it became commercial. So unlike George Street and Queen Street, which were immediately very, very desirable addresses, Princes Street never really made it. And so construction started in the 1770s, and by the early 19th century, it was already becoming commercialized, and the architecture was losing its integrity to retail. So it's always been a bit of a problem. During the 1960s, then it was really the first focus for the council in terms of modernizing the city. So it was where we were going to have our dual carriageway. A number of the Victorian buildings were demolished, like the New Club. The New Club is actually a listed building now, but it's a piece of brutalism. And before it was a Victorian building. So it's piecemeal. And now, of course, we have the decline of retail. So the city needs to respond to that. Having said all that, it's the best location and it's the best view of any street in Scotland, probably in the UK. If you're sat there in the New Club looking out, you have the most extraordinary view. So the future is definitely some sort of mixed model. Given that people want to shop online, that's fair enough. There's no real role for department stores in the city anymore. The city has to move to a mixed model for Princes Street. So the Johnny Walker Centre, which is in the old Binns department store, is the way it's going to evolve, whether we like it or not to some extent, because the buildings need a use. And the other, the Danish company that's bought Jenner's have very interesting plans for the building. It should be restored to its glory, like Liberty in London. And so they've got good plans for that. The Debenhams is one of the most beautiful buildings, Lake Georgian buildings, fantastic interior, so there's potential there. So one by one, it will be fixed. It's too valuable a strip of property, and it has too great, the views are too great for it to be lost. It will not be lost, but it will take time. So I would have thought it would be 15 years really before it gets back to its former status.
But are you guys playing quite a strong role?
We are. I mean, we get involved in every every plan, all developers want to increase the height of the buildings in Princes Street. So that's always a challenge because Edinburgh has a relatively serene skyline, which is punctured by spires and churches and important monuments, but not by just the bulk of buildings for commercial reasons. So we continually go back and forth over how tall the buildings should be, not allowing another floor to be added. Every developer wants a rooftop bar, which is the bane of our lives. So, little by little, there's encroachment, building by building, and then you have a rooftop bar, and then you have all the associated buildings on the rooftop that go with that. So our challenge at the moment is to obviously support the city in finding a sustainable use for Princes Street, but also then to make sure that as far as possible, for a street that's lost a lot of its integrity, the buildings do not damage it further.
And when you talk about mixed use, are you talking about mixed use in individual buildings or across the street or both?
In individual buildings. So the Jenner's proposal is a mixture of residential, hotel and retail and hospitality, everything in one building. It's this wonderful sort of, again, Jacobean sort of late Victorian confection. So then, obviously you've got the new club that will stay there, but then the other buildings will more and more become hospitality. There'll be some retail left there. But that's a fact of life. As soon as the St James Centre opened, Princes Street immediately started to look tatty and had lost its way. Hopefully George Street will retain its integrity and its sort of spark. And George Street's got a good mixture of hospitality and retail and so on. A little bit of residential left. There's interesting new plans for George Street, basically to strip away all the clutter. What we find ourselves doing lots of the time is just saying less is more. Our streets are really ruined often by traffic and by street clutter, by endless street signs, by traffic lights, by unnecessary detail, bus stops and so on. And many European cities have sort of moved beyond that. Great Italian historic city centres or in Amsterdam, they've cleared that away. You have the sets, which is what we call cobbles. We have the setted streets, and then we have our beautiful buildings. And why do you need anything else? The minimum of traffic, the minimum of public transport, just open the spaces up. So a lot of our time is just spent trying to argue as persuasively as possible to get rid of the cars and to open the streets up and make them less cluttered, to be honest.
One at the back.
Nick, just firstly a clarification. We're very fortunate in Donaldson's in that Airbnb is part of the deeds of purchase that we cannot have Airbnb.
Right, excellent.
So I hope that gives you a bit of
Yeah, great.
I'm interested to hear more about this neglect point you raised earlier.
Yeah.
I'm fortunate to own somewhere else within the new town, and I have actually been very surprised at how neglected some of the properties are. So the question you need to yourself is, so what do we do about it? We know it's there, so what do we do about it? And a point for yourself, George, around, COP26, we know that we need to move to a more carbon neutral housing estate. So what do we do with buildings like this that are very difficult to renovate? What can we do then to think about our own, to lower the carbon footprint in each of the properties?
Do you want to do neglect first? And
also the sensitive retrofit of historic buildings in Edinburgh is something that we're focused on. So there's no easy solution to that. But we need to avoid interventions in historic buildings which are well-intentioned from a climate response point of view, but actually damage them. And we need to work with the buildings. And we need to remember that an existing historic structure has got so much carbon built into it anyway that demolishing it is a disaster. On the neglect point, it's not obviously it's much better than it was, and the fact that the property values in the new town particularly are so high means that generally people do look after their buildings. The issue in the old town is much more severe, where you've got more of a mixed bag. It's partly education. It's making sure that people are aware of the basics of maintenance, of clearing your gutters, of making sure that your roof is checked once a year by a good roof surveyor. It doesn't cost a lot of money. It saves you long-term, a lot of money. Making sure that your joinery and all the bits and bobs of your property are looked after. When people buy a property in the new town, we work with various estate agents to make sure that people get an information pack, like Retties, are supporters of Edinburgh World Heritage, so they do that for us. So it's that type of thing. There's no immediate fix, but people don't need to take individual responsibility. It's a very valuable asset that they have. As I said, Glasgow is much better from that point of view.
COP26, where do I start with that? I mean, David Attenborough this morning on Radio 4 said it was probably the more significant moment, he thinks, in his lifetime. And the decisions that they've got to make at COP26 are quite big. We're always balancing that with economics and everything else, but what price are we going to put on the environment? And I think that balance between making the right green moves on a building and balancing the economics of doing that and how you're going to save are one of the biggest challenges when it comes to retrofit. There's a statistic which I've researched, and it is true, that they believe that 80% of all the buildings that we have today will still be using in 2050. So in 2050, 80% of all the existing buildings in the world will still be using today. So you could argue that to become net zero or zero carbon or low carbon, the retrofit challenge is probably the biggest thing we face. You know, we've got 29 million houses across the UK, 29 million. Now, I can't imagine there's a high proportion of them comply with the current building regulations. Even if you go back to the 1990 building regulations, if you guessed we were building, let's say on average, 150, 170,000 houses a year, you do that over the last 30 years, there's 3 and a bit million houses. So there's probably between 25 and 26 million homes across the UK that probably don't comply with the 1990 building regulations. And when you look at the amount of reduction in carbon emissions, we're always comparing it to 1990s emission standards. That's one thing we've got to be careful of. It's not current carbon emissions. When we're talking about reductions, it's going back 30 years. So there's a little bit distortion there of what can be achieved. We're supposed to be reducing global temperatures by 1.5 degrees. If we're going to do that, then retrofit's one of the biggest things that we face. It really is. It's not easy, and every building's different. So if I looked at a space like this, and if I came in and said, right, we're going to retrofit this, let's take off all the period features, let's dry line all the internal walls with insulation, you know, we might need to put them back on, but the space is going to become smaller, let's rip off all the timber panel and let's say the floor. Before you know it, you've got no real original architecture left, and you're changing the quality of the space as well. It's not easy to go into someone who might even live in a nice Georgian house and say, let's take off all your skirting boards, all your architraves, all your cornice and all your picture rails, and let's dry line all the external walls with internal insulation and put them all back. On smaller properties, it's really difficult because you don't want to be losing too much space off the room. So that's a big, big challenge. It's finding that balance about fabric first, which is a phrase that you'll hear a lot with retrofit. You know, I'll talk a lot about let's deal with the fabric first before we talk about any clever green technologies. You know, air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, solar panels, you know, small wind turbines. All of that stuff is really, really good and very important. But there's no point in putting those in unless you've insulated your building to the highest level. Thankfully, there's developments in technology. Even on listed buildings now, we sometimes take the single glazing out, and companies like Pilkington's Glass have developed a very, very thin double glazing system. It's not as high performance as the thicker systems, but obviously if you put thick double glazing on an old building, it changes the look and feel of it. So luckily, technology is moving forward a bit, even with simple architectural elements, not the clever technology, to make the retrofit of them become greener. It's always going to be balanced with cost, and we can legislate for it a bit, and that's happening. I mean, I don't know if you saw a lot of the stuff that the Westminster government published about changes we were going to make to buildings. Obviously, the document that came out last week, and it's like 360 pages long, covers everything from nuclear power all the way down to buildings and homes. But in fairness, they've set some pretty tough targets, quite tough ones, and we've got to balance that with economic factors and what people can really afford. So one simple measure that the government have done in England has banned gas boilers in new build housing from 2025. And what's actually really good about that is a lot of house builders out there who are making the move to renewable forms of heating now. They're not waiting till 2025 to do it. That's costing a bit of extra money, because to change a gas boiler, let's say to change a gas boiler in a standard 4-bedroom house and do all the fitting and maybe new radiators, you're probably in at like £4,500 quid. To do an air source heat pump, you're probably talking £10,000. So that's a big decision that you've got to make as either a builder or developer or homeowner to make that change. There's government incentives being put in place. There's a thing called the Renewable Heat Incentive that actually ends in March next year, but there's a new grant system that's come in. I mean, the number of changes that have been made to green legislation actually drives me around the bend. I think that's one of the problems that any homeowner and any builder faces. We've had the Green Deal. I think we've had something else about 3 years ago. I mean, I was promoting the Green Deal about 8-9 years ago, and that just died a death. So it was well-intentioned, but it wasn't really thought through about how it was going to work. But I think it's quite an exciting time in some ways that, you know, the Architects Journal have put Retro First as their biggest campaign over the next 10, 15 years. It's a big campaign about let's look at retrofitting and keeping existing buildings first. Nick's mentioned about, you know, the amount of energy that's put into building this building a long time ago. It's been amazing, really, the embodied energy in this building. If this was ever demolished, which obviously it wouldn't have been, it would have been a massive loss. But then I still go around building sites and I just see loads of concrete and loads of steel. All the time. And they are such energy-intensive materials to use. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge, I think, for research and development. Luckily, we've got some brilliant universities, you know, here in Scotland and throughout the UK, brilliant universities doing quite amazing R&D about new materials. And in some ways, they've been inspired by Mother Nature. You know, Mother Nature, that's not some like hippie little phrase. You know, Mother Nature is actually probably the best architect ever. You know, she gets the balance absolutely right in quite a scientific way to create ecosystems that work and everything's in harmony. And that actually becomes a lot from kind of material technology, you know, leaves and plants and skins and, you know, how things breathe and how they exist in an ecosystem. And it's quite beautiful, I think, that a lot of universities who are doing massive R&D are being inspired by the science of nature, not the hippie form of nature, the science of nature, to start looking at new materials and new technologies and how they can affect the built environment. It's really exciting, but we've got to do it a lot quicker. Much quicker. And there's lots of conversations about new builds, like even the government announcing the thing on boilers. It's a new build piece of legislation. Well, if we're building 250,000 houses a year, that's 1% of the total housing stock. Actually, to hit all the targets for 2050, we've got to deal with the 20-odd million existing homes, and they're not really doing that. And there's been a lot of fear, in fact, a lot of journalists saying, what, are you going to force everybody to change their gas boiler in their existing house? And there's a bit of me thinking, yeah, we kind of should, but we've got to help people be able to get there. That was a very long answer to a short question. Let's do one more here at the front, because we're going to run out of time.
Just return back to Donaldson's again. I'd be really interested in your opinions about how well the redevelopment of the building has been carried out. I was conscious, you know, some years ago, having seen some of the original flats, that I felt that they lacked functionality. There was very little storage. There was very poor services, and I don't know if this is true of how things have developed, because this was a number of years ago. So I'm very keen to hear your opinions.
Well, I'm going to remain neutral on that, given my position as an independent charity. I won't comment. Other than, as I said, we commented through the planning process, so our documents are online, but I'll leave it to them.
Look, the restoration and conversion of any building's tough. It's really tough. And there'll be some apartments that you guys might walk into and go, it's not for me. And then somebody else will walk in and go, this is perfect for me. It's even when you're talking about style and design, the number of people that will walk around any apartment, not just in this building, and they'll go, no, it's not my taste. You know, and then my mum will walk in and go, oh, I love this. I'd love to live in this. Every restoration project and conversion is a big challenge, and I think you'll see lots of different flats in different styles, different spaces. I mean, if you look at some of the ones in the lower level, where you're down in the arches, like in the basement of the building, I mean, talk about amazing spaces, like when it comes to small space design that I get involved in a lot, they're awesome. But you might not like them. You might go down there and think, well, it feels a little bit subterranean.
What's more interesting, functionality?
Yeah, and well, personally, I'd say I think the function, but I'm going to be slightly biased because I've been across the building since day one. I didn't design it, by the way. I wasn't the architect for it. But it's nice to walk into a building and see built-in wardrobes in bedrooms, which in a lot of developments you just never even see decent integrated storage. There's some other spaces where we've struggled to get it in, so we've had to compensate for that. I say we compensate elsewhere for it in the flat. And then everybody wants en suites these days. You know, everybody. You know, someone said to me recently, they walked into this flat, they had 3 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms, and they went, where's the 3rd bathroom? And I thought, oh my, does every single bedroom need a bloody shower room or bathroom all the time? So people have got really high expectations. And unfortunately, with any other old building, you've got to make some compromises, and sometimes you just can't fit them in. So, as I say, you might walk around and see some that you think this works really, really well. There's some areas of the builds that I know I've heard people walk around and go, ooh, I'm not sure about that. You know, there's mezzanine floors in some of the apartments. Are they functional? Well, they're functional because you've got great mezzanines and it's made the use of space and it's added an extra bedroom. Does it give the privacy that you really want? It depends how you live. It really, really does. If you've got a family home with open plan living in a mezzanine, it might not work if you've got loads of kids running around because you don't have that privacy. But I know a lot of couples who are downsizing, who actually, you know, they've sold their house, their kids have moved on, and they come to an apartment where they go, do you know what, I like a bit of open plan living. You know, that mezzanine might be a bit, it's not quite what I'm used to, but actually I really like it. So I'm not skirting the question, but it does come down to personal taste. But I think the functionality is very, very good. And some works better in other flats than others. And some of it has been led by the constraints of the building. But what I will say is that the team, what I do know, the architects and the historians that work together really, really closely do their absolute best to make them as functional as possible. And some work better than others. And when you have a look around, you'll see it. And when you go and have a look at the 3-bedroom, what I call a townhouse inside an old building, because it doesn't feel like an apartment, I guarantee there'll be bits where you walk around, you're like, ooh, I'm not sure about that. Guarantee it. And there's bits that I've thought that because I wouldn't want to live that way, but other people I know that would, it would suit their lifestyle. I mean, I've done a few bits of filming with the boys at the back there today, and I've said, you know, there's apartments in here that will suit many different lifestyles. And there's some apartments that will just not suit how you want to live at all, but I still think they're pretty functional.
Okay.
Well, thanks so much, everyone. I think Mark's going to do a little roundup because he's going to
thank you very
tell you
much.
about the next steps.
Thank you, George and Nick. That was very, very interesting and thoroughly enjoyed by everybody, I think. So please, a round of applause. Thank you very much.